Very good. So my name's Gloria Charland, and I work on nutrient pollution and cyanobacteria issues here in northeastern Illinois, where I live in the Manitou Creek watershed. Last fall, my friend Doris Solarius mentioned to me that the Sierra Club National Toxics team was interested in forming a sub-team to work on cyanotoxins, which are the toxins produced by blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And here we are today. I'm really excited that we have folks attending tonight from all over the country. And I hope that after Albert's presentation, you'll be motivated to help us work on this issue at the national level. We'll talk some more about this new National Sierra Club team at the end and how you can get involved at a variety of levels. Don't be too worried about taking notes. As I said, we are recording this and Albert will be sharing his slides with us. We'll send all of that out tomorrow. And here's Doris to introduce our speaker.
I'm honored to introduce Albert because I've been in awe of him for a long time. This is because of all that this Sierra Club volunteer has done for the Sierra Club and the environment, and especially our waters. The Clean Water Act is an important but very complicated tool for protecting waters. This is why we need lawyers like Albert to help us understand and use this important law. He will explain how it can help us address problems of toxic algae. Green is not always good. Sometimes it is dangerous. But there are ways to make those who manage our waters comply with the law and actually begin to make a difference. After Albert's presentation, there will be time for questions. Please type them into the chat. There are a lot of people on this call, but we will try to answer as many questions as possible. More information can be found on Albert's website, which appears on the last slide that will be sent to you. And it is a wealth of information and I recommend it. So here's Albert.
Okay, do you want to go to the first slide? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I hate PowerPoint. I hate Zoom. I hate the fact that we can't meet together. So I'm going to do the best I can. I really hate the tyranny of not being able to just discuss things with people, but I'm told it's impossible. And so I have to restrain my anarchistic tendencies and allow Gloria and Doris and Katya to run the questions here. I am a lawyer. I practiced since 1979. I know I look like I'm 29, but I'm actually older than that. And I wanted to say I've worked on nutrient pollution a great deal as a lawyer. There's a lot of slides here on science, and I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. I have worked a lot with scientists on this matter. I will go ahead and tell the story. My first contact with nutrient pollution and this whole issue occurred when I was 8 years old. We were on a family vacation and we'd reached Portland, Oregon. And my father worked for the Public Health Service. Now, people who know me can't believe this because I'm such a mild-mannered person, but my father was a sort of garrulous guy who was the sort of person who could be unpleasant at meetings if necessary. And so the federal government got a hold of him and flew him to New York to talk to the laundry detergent companies about phosphorus in their laundry detergent. And I'm certain he wasn't the sole source of this accomplishment, but they did get it out of the laundry detergent, or mainly out of the laundry detergent in the 60s. And then later we worked on getting phosphorus out of dishwasher detergent. And we've been pretty successful there too. I want to emphasize too, I'm going to stress about, as the title says, what we can do under current law. Obviously, it would be nice to amend some of these laws, but that requires a different set of skills and probably a different Congress from the one that we have now. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Yes, I come at it, first of all, with a Great Lakes focus. That's a beach in an area that we didn't think was that nasty in Wisconsin, but that gives you an idea. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to briefly outline the problem before we get to the law, which is what I'm really going to focus on, because I'm hoping you're all Sierra Club volunteers and you'll be able to work at the state and federal and local level to address some of these problems. And that's where the action is now. The basic problem is nitrogen and phosphorus are both good things. They're elements, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And here we see some of the sources that we've got. Next slide. Okay, cultural eutrophication. It sounds, one of our biggest problems in this whole area is that the terminology is terrible. When you talk about nutrients, it sounds like it's great. It's building strong bodies 12 ways or something. And they are great. And without nitrogen and phosphorus, we'd all be dead. However, if you have too much of it, it doesn't work. Or it creates too much life in a sense. It creates algal blooms. Then, particularly if you're on the toxics committee, you know that cyanobacteria create a large number of different cyanotoxins, which can literally kill you. They do kill pets every year. They shut down the Toledo water system for a weekend, which caused a lot of concern, obviously. 600 miles of the Ohio River was unsafe to swim in 2015. We've had similar algal blooms in the Ohio River. The other place, well, there's all sorts of places that are famous or notorious for nutrient pollution problems and cyanobacteria. Florida, of course, is another hot spot. Then the Illinois River in Arkansas, Puget Sound, Long Island Sound. These are just ones I've looked at personally, but it's actually a world problem. Parts of the Baltic Sea have a huge issue here. The China Sea has a huge nutrient problem. A lot of the Chinese farmers think that if a little fertilizer is good, then a whole lot more should be better. And this has caused massive problems there. Next slide. By the way, you're going to get all of these websites and things. Some of them well, they're all been chosen to try and describe the issue and allow you to do your own research. Of course, the best one is the immortal work, Phosphorus Pollution for Lawyers and Other Ignorant Persons, which was written by me, of course. And this one was my understanding of the issues based on working on it I worked actively mainly on nutrient pollution as a lawyer since the 90s. Has been one of the areas that I dealt in. I brought a lot of lawsuits about it, argued in a lot of agency sessions. So next slide. All right, so you saw the basic problem. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is another issue. You go out to lakes. The one thing we got to look at, there's a toxic problem, and that's the cyanobacteria. But people don't really want to swim in water that's full of Eurasian milfoil either. If you've ever paddled through a bunch of, plant growth, that can be unfun. So that's another set of issues that we need to look at. Okay, now Roman numeral 2, next slide. So what's the problem? Like I said, phosphorus and nitrogen are not bad things. They're good things. But if we have too much of them, then you get either unnatural algal growth, cyanobacteria, which is not technically algae, but it's bacteria, but it's also known as blue-green algae. And then there's this unnatural plant growth, which can also be a problem. It's the cyanobacteria that causes the toxins, but as I said, the other things are not good either. Then you can get, even among us, nutrient pollution nerds, you can get an argument. In fact, we don't know in many cases what is the worst source of the problem, because in some places, well, like in Chesapeake Bay, the main issue is chicken shit. My father used to get a roar out of crowds saying that the biggest pollution problem in the Missouri River watershed is bullshit. And it was true. There were all these massive cattle containment facilities that were doing what cattle have to do, and that was causing problems in the Missouri River. In the Mississippi, the major source is anhydrous ammonia and urea, which is used as fertilizer. That's the source of nitrogen. And then everywhere sewage treatment plants put phosphorus into the water unless the water is treated very well. Now, unfortunately, and we're going to get this next slide, that our ability to control some of the sources of excess nutrient pollution are better in some areas than others. Can we go to the next slide, please? Something else we're going to have to focus on is the forms of these things, because I hate to say this, I'd really like to make everything simple here, but it's just not going to happen. So unfortunately, if you're going to work in this area, you're going to have to learn some stuff. One of the things you're going to have to learn about is the forms of nitrogen, because there are different regulations and different problems as to all of them. Pure nitrogen's not a problem. It's up in the air. It's fine. Ammonia is a toxin, and that's pretty well regulated. That kills fish. And we spent a lot of time arguing about ammonia because it's extremely poisonous to fish and mussels and other critters. But it is, and it does take oxygen out of the water. The area that's been most controversial is nitrate, and that's because it works as a fertilizer. It works as a nutrient. I'm going to give you one little bit of technical stuff on writing water quality standards, and this sort of explains part of the problem we've had regulating nutrient pollution. When you write a water quality standard for a toxin, something that kills aquatic life, it's not easy, but what they basically do is that the joke was attributed to Bismarck that lovers of sausages and laws should not see how they're made. Well, this also applies to water quality standards. What they do is they take totally non-consenting critters, drop them in concentrations of toxins, and count how many die. And at the concentration in which 50% of them die, you have the LC50, and they use that to develop a water quality standard. I won't go any more on that. The problem with nutrients like nitrate and phosphorus is that at the relevant level, in many cases, it's not toxic. You can't throw fathead minnows in a tank of phosphorus and count how many die, because they won't die. What will happen instead is that if you throw phosphorus in a pond, it will cause an algal bloom, which will take all the oxygen out of the water, and then the fish will die. Okay, next slide, please. Going on to phosphorus here. Same story. And here you've got another tricky thing, because there's basically two forms of phosphorus that we're looking at. One is total phosphorus, and that includes organic phosphorus, generally in the form of phosphate. It's attached to particles, or it may be in plants. Then there is what's called soluble reactive phosphorus. This is sort of the pure stuff. This is the heroin as opposed to it's what the algae will eat up immediately. And sometimes they'll measure you'll see a measure and they'll say, oh, the level of phosphorus is very low. And I've been told this by regulators who should know better. And they say, oh, well, there's no SRP in this. It doesn't matter. Well, that's because you haven't counted where all the phosphorus is. It's now in the plants. And if you haven't measured the plants, you haven't found the phosphorus. And that's something else we need to worry about. We're most concerned about putting this pure, heroin in the water because of the effect it has. But it doesn't stay there very long in that form. It goes into other forms. Next slide. All right. Now we're going to get to what I mainly want to talk about, which is what we can do about current law. And here we really have to break things down into major areas. One is phosphorus from what I'll call row crop agriculture, basically fertilizer, corn, other things that we put fertilizer on. That is basically not regulated by the Clean Water Act. There is Section 3019, which gives states money to help work on that. There are some state programs to try and control phosphorus from agriculture, but there's a specific exemption in the Clean Water Act for phosphorus from agriculture. Sewage treatment plants, those are point sources. Those we can actually regulate. They're clearly covered by the Clean Water Act. And we can work on that by reviewing permits and objecting to permits conditions that don't control the phosphorus or nitrogen discharges or nitrate discharges carefully enough. Then there are these other things, CAFOs, refineries, urban runoff. Refineries is what I'll call a conventional point source, but CAFOs and urban runoff are technically point sources too, and they are covered by the Clean Water Act. However, they're much harder to regulate. With your what I'll call a conventional point source, like a POTW, a sewage treatment plant, you got a pipe that's coming from a plant or a factory. You have a pipe that's coming from a plant. We can measure that pretty easily. We can put limits on that. For reasons we'll go into later, with CAFOs or urban runoff, you can't point to a point. And so it's much harder to regulate, and the law doesn't do it very well. Next. All right, I'm gonna go through this and pretty quickly, all of this, because I do want to encourage questions. Let's look at nutrients from row crop agriculture. As I said, it's very difficult to approach that currently. The Clean Water Act doesn't cover it. We do have these numbers here, these long swept. Those are all articles I've written that are on my website, or I think those are ones I've written on my website. And they attempt to describe the legal situation as to row crop agriculture, which is basically not covered by the Clean Water Act. I got to say, there's an exception to every exception I'm going to give you. It's a very complicated body of laws, but in general, fertilizer is not going to be covered by the Clean Water Act. So what can we do? We can support state, federal, local voluntary programs to encourage farmers to not put so much fertilizer on their soil. You can learn about USDA and the state bureaus and things whose job it is to try and encourage farmers to not over apply fertilizer and to use some of these other things. There are also federal farm bill. The Sierra Club used to work hard on the federal farm bill. It hasn't done so much lately. That is very important. It creates, basically, the agricultural community is given a lot of federal goodies not get too technical, but there are strings attached to those that we've managed to get in many places that require conservation as a condition for getting those federal subsidies. Now, unfortunately, those strings aren't enforced very well either. So that's another possible situation that we might want to look at. For example, there are provisions in the federal farm bill now that says, okay, we'll give you this crop insurance at a very low rate. It's actually income insurance, but in order for you to be entitled to that, you can't destroy wetlands or you can't plant on highly erodible soil. And those are the sorts of things that we need to encourage and strengthen. Next slide, please. Next. Next. Nope. Okay, now we're on, we should be on agricultural practices that can help. There we go. And these are just a list of things that are done on farms now, which we are trying to encourage. There's a whole lot of people working on these things. I'm not the expert on that, although I have been out in the fields and stomped around. A lot of these things are fairly simple, but they all share the unfortunate side drawback that they tend to cost farmers money, so they don't want to do them. That's not true of all of them. Sometimes some of these things can be done well enough so that the farmer actually makes money off of them. But they are, that's a difficulty here. And since we're dealing basically with voluntary programs, the problem is we've seen with a lot of voluntary programs is that not everybody volunteers, and often it's the worst actors who are the ones who precisely do not volunteer. Next slide. All right, now we're in the fat area. This is where I've frankly done most of my work over the last 20 years and where we've had most of our success, because the Clean Water Act does control pollution that harms national water quality. Okay, but again, nothing simple. How do you write a NIPIDs permit? That's another whole class, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. The whole idea of the 1972 Clean Water Act was that we were going to require all of these point sources to get a permit. And we're going to put limits in those permits that we're going to do two things. First of all, they were going to try and put limits in the permits so that nobody was allowed to discharge anything that we thought would hurt something. I'm trying to make this simple. So nobody's allowed to discharge something where it will cause a violation of water quality standards. The other thing, and this is the elimination part, they actually thought they were going to eliminate all discharges by 1985. That's what Congress said in the Clean Water Act in 1972. It didn't quite happen. We still have discharges and we have not met water quality standards. But the goal of meeting standards by 1985 is still in the federal code if you want to read it. So it's sad. Okay, so how do we write these limits so that nothing hurts anything? One is to, like I said, have these numeric water quality standards. We have water quality standards now that say something like the waters of the state shall be free from unnatural algal growth. That's comes from the Illinois rule, but your state probably has a similar rule. The problem with that narrative standard is that the permit writers look at that and they say, I don't know how to deal with that. I can't write a permit based on keeping the waters free from unnatural algal growth. The guys who write permits are all engineers. And this does not compute. So what we want in general is numeric water quality standards that say something like streams in the state of Wisconsin shall not have more than 0.1 milligrams per liter of phosphorus. The regulators know how to deal with that. They can write a permit that says you can't discharge a concentration greater than 0.1 milligram per liter. So that's where there's been a lot of the action. So let's look now. Now we're getting to the problem areas, because the states, by and large, have been reluctant to do these things because they cost dischargers money. So what do we do to address nutrient pollution from point sources? The first thing, as I said, is we can work on numeric water quality standards. And that's a kind of backward way into it. But what does happen is if we establish numeric water quality standards, and that has been done in some states, that forces the permit writers to write stronger permits, because now they've got a number. These engineers who couldn't deal with prevent unnatural algal growth know how to deal with 0.1 milligrams per liter. So that's been a big issue. Of course, the hard part is setting that 0.1 milligrams per liter. Then the other thing, though, is that you don't have to have numeric water quality standards. The law is clear that they're supposed to write permits that prevent violations of narrative standards, but that's hard to do. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Everything about the Clean Water Act has to do with this balance between the federal government and the state and local regulators. Traditionally, it was up to the states to work on water quality, and most of them didn't do much of it. The first federal law on water quality was the 1948 Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And then there was the Clean Water Act. But they both did a great deal to try and respect the state's authority in these areas. So there's this continual back and forth between the states. By the way, I've given you a lot of citations here to statutes and things. I'm not expecting that you're all going to run out and go and read 33 USC section 1313C. However, I'm going to give you a little hint. Some of you are going to need to hire lawyers, and you're going to want to get lawyers that you can afford. I'm going to tell you a real secret here. Lawyers are lazy. And if you present them with something that already gives them the citations so that they can just go and find them, it will be a lot quicker and they're more likely to help. So they're supposed to set up these standards. They're supposed to look at them. The states are supposed to look at them frequently. Actually, what the law clearly says is that there shall be a triennial review. It's never enforced by US EPA. Some of the states do their triennial review well, I joke about in some states it's a centennial review, but they pretty much do it when they feel like it. Okay. So you can work at the state level to get numeric standards, and that will have the effect of hopefully of forcing the permit writers to write limits, which will reduce the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen going into your water. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other thing is the federal government has authority to set standards itself. It's quite clear it has this authority, but if you ask the US EPA people to do this and point out, by the way, Louisiana doesn't have a standard for ammonia, even though they've got all sorts of refineries that are putting out ammonia. Can't you put out an ammonia standard to control this? They will generally act like you're asking them to send federal troops to take over the state school system. It's considered just an appalling attack on states' rights to ask the federal government to do this, even though it's quite clear in the Federal Clean Water Act that they have the authority to do it. In this lawsuit, which I was part of, Gulf Restoration Network versus Jackson, we actually sued US EPA for failing to set up some standards for nitrogen and phosphorus. We ultimately lost. Basically, the court deferred to the agency and said, well, yes, the situation is terrible, but it's not so terrible that we won't defer to the federal government. And they say they're trying, so we'll let them try some more. And that's pretty much what it came out on that case. Recently, Northwest Environmental Advocates, Nina Bell's group, won a case not on nutrients, but on toxins in the state of Washington, in which it was clear the state was not doing the job. Northwest Environmental Advocates petitioned in 2013. And then finally this year, well, actually a couple of weeks ago, they got a good decision out of the court saying, EPA, you got to do your job now. You're going to have to write standards because the state of Washington hasn't. It's a great decision, and it does put some limit on how long EPA can delay doing anything. I just wish that I wasn't reading a 2021 decision about a 2013 petition, but that's dealing with the government. Next slide. Then state processes. Some states, you can make your own petition. Illinois is one of those. A lot of states are very hard to get water quality standards changes, but some states you can petition in the state level and you'll actually get somewhere. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another step that can be taken. If the states aren't writing limits to control nutrient pollution, to protect narrative standards, again, this is something that runs like blood through the whole Clean Water Act, is that the states are first given the opportunity to do something. And if they totally fail, then the federal government can do it. And so there is a petition for corrective action under these regulations, and you can petition the US EPA and say, EPA, Tennessee is totally screwing up here. They are not doing the job. You've got to take the program back. If Tennessee can't run its permitting system properly, then the law is clear that you have to. Again, the problem is EPA sits on these petitions forever. You can eventually sue. I want to drop back 1 second and say I'm being a little bit more negative here than I should be on a lot of these things, because you can push these buttons and they don't work instantly, but they put pressure on the states. They put limits on what can be done. And I've been involved in 2 or 3 of these petitions for corrective actions. They've always failed in the sense that ultimately the EPA denied the petition. But in the meantime, the states generally made a lot of changes that improved the situation. So it's hard on your ego. You file a petition. There was one in Ohio, for example, or in Illinois. You file a petition. The state and the federal government go back and forth for 5 or 10 years, make a lot of changes to the state program that are what you wanted, and then they deny your petition saying, oh, well, the state program's great. Well, it wasn't great when you filed the petition. Now it may be tolerable, but that's the game we've got to play. Okay, next slide. All right. As I mentioned, even under the narrative standards, the permit writer is supposed to write numeric limits. So we have a standard. I'll use Illinois because I brought this law. So the Prairie Rivers Network is my case. So the permit writer doesn't put in a limit on phosphorus because he's looking at a standard that says there shall be no unnatural algal growth. Permit writer says, I can't deal with that. I'm not going to put a limit on phosphorus in order to prevent unnatural algal growth. I can't I don't know how that works. So he doesn't do anything. However, the law is clear that he's supposed to do something. And so what they do is, in a lot of states, they just put in a limit in the permit saying you can't cause a violation of water quality standards. Well, that's worth something, except the discharger can't do anything with that very well either, because, okay, I shouldn't discharge phosphorus to cause a violation of water quality standards, but what's the number there? So in Prairie Rivers Network versus Illinois Pollution Control Board, we said the permit had to be overturned because they didn't have a numeric phosphorus limit that was enforceable against the discharger, and we actually won. As a result of that case, now almost all Illinois NPDES permits have limits on phosphorus discharges. And we've got, that's one area in which we've had a lot of success in a few states in which we've managed to force the permit writers to put limits on phosphorus. And as a result, there's a lot less phosphorus pollution in the water. Next slide, please. Okay, then, like I said, you got a number of states. And Portland, actually, the leading case on this is City of Portland, is actually Northwest Environmental Advocates versus City of Portland, which was not on nutrients, but it was on a different problem. And what they had was a condition in the permit saying that you could not cause or contribute to a violation of water quality standards. That's the same theory we went in with against the Water Reclamation District and said, you are causing or contributing to massive algal blooms in the Illinois River and the Des Plaines River. We went, that case went on for 5 years. We finally settled it in 2017, and we've gotten substantial limits on phosphorus discharges by the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which I believe is the largest sewage treatment operation in the country. Just a matter of, well, it's Chicago. They discharge 2 billion gallons per day of sewage. And so that was a very substantial victory in terms of getting a limit and substantial reductions in phosphorus discharges from the Chicago wastewater treatment system. We're looking at that in other places. Okay, next slide. All right, now we're in the hard areas. I'm going to go kind of quickly over these because they're tough. CAFOs, you guys all know what a CAFO is. I wish I could ask you all to raise your hand, but we can't do that here. So these are these massive hog, chicken, or beef facilities in which they feed animals for eventual meat processing, and they do what animals have to do. If the wastewater or if the pollution comes directly from the CAFO facility where the animals are kept, that is a point source. However, US EPA decided in the 70s that if you put the wet manure in a truck, drive it down the street a ways and spray it on a farm field, that's not a point source anymore. That is fertilizer. And so the law is not very clear on that. They say you can't over apply, but there's all sorts of complications as to what over application is. There have been efforts over the last decade to try and get EPA to regulate this better. Those were knocked down pretty badly by this National Pork Producers Council case, which basically what EPA was trying to say was that it was like a discharge if you were operating in a manner that was likely, if you were operating your CAFO in a manner that was likely to cause pollution, then that was a discharge and it should be regulated. The problem is that what National Pork Producers said is, no, you got to prove there's a discharge. And if there's no discharge, they don't need to get a discharge permit. We could discuss that too much. There's another law that I'm going to just touch on, which is RCRA. There was a good case in Eastern District of Washington in which basically manure from a dairy operation had gotten into groundwater that people were using, and the people there were able to bring a successful lawsuit against concentrated animal feeding operations there. Yet another area is urban runoff. This is probably the smallest. Every place I've looked at, this has not been one of the more major sources of pollution, but it is significant in some places. What was interesting to me was that leaves are a significant source of phosphorus. If you let your leaves drop on the ground and they just sit there and rot, well, then they fertilize the grass the next year or whatever it is. But if you carefully rake them into the street, as many people do, then they wash into the gutter, and all the phosphorus in the leaves then become water pollution. And so that's something else going there. Final slide, well, two final slides. We'll go down one. Yes, now another one now. The urban runoff is on the leaves. That's how to get hold of me. Now keep going, go back to the identification slide. One after this, yes. You're gonna see this later. There's the website, and it's got a catchy title, www.albertettinger.com. And that's my actual cell phone number. And you're gonna get this so you don't have to scratch it down. And then the final slide, which is the most important one, which is me with my granddaughter. And with that, I think I've left at least 15 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Albert, so much. I was going to start the questions and alternate with Katya. We've got some interesting questions, and I think we can do them in order. We also have some interesting comments from people who've been doing some of these, enduring some of these problems, and those are helpful to see. But the first question is, aquaculture regulated like agriculture regarding these pollutants?
Now, I'm gonna have to punt and say I just don't know that much about aquaculture. Well, I could speculate, but let's go on. I'll just punt there, and we'll have to look at that some other time. I work mainly in the Midwest, and aquaculture is not a big problem in Chicago. So but there are certainly issues with that.
Well, it's a good new issue for us to find out more about.
It is.
So Katya, do you want to ask the one about buffer zones?
Yes, so they asked a question, and they were speaking about Governor Dayton. Not sure what state that was in, but they said that they enacted a buffer zone regulation a few years ago, and oops, this chat thing is not good for. And they asked if this regulation reduced agricultural runoff to any extent.
Well, I don't know. There are a number of states that have such regulations, and we generally do favor them. So not knowing exactly which state it is and not having studied the results, I can't answer your specific question, but I do want to give a little information on that. Yeah, I think the buffer zones are generally good. They're going to prevent the amount of soil runoff, which is very important. And a lot of the phosphorus is attached to the soil. The problem is that in many places, certainly in the areas I'm working on in the central part of the country, there are tile drains. And the phosphorus and the nitrogen, they don't stick on the soil. They go down into the tile drain, and then they're mainlined into some ditch or creek and go under your buffer strips. So the buffer strips are good. They do stop phosphorus that is attached to soil from reaching the stream or ditch or wherever it's going, if they're constructed properly. But they're not a complete solution to the problem, certainly not in corn country where you've got tile drains. There are some other things about tile drain. Tile drains are, people go out in the country and they think that they're, oh, this is nature, this is the country. I can tell you, drive around the Midwest and look at corn country, you are looking at one of the most unnatural environments in the world. Downtown Chicago has got more native plant life there than the area and those areas which are all tile drained. All the natural vegetation has been taken off, and you've just got open fields with drains under it.
The next question was about precision agriculture. Precision agriculture. Is it going to promote ecological agriculture? I see that Debbie put in a comment about it has caused some problems because it recommended certain things that weren't working very well. But Albert, I've never heard of precision agriculture. What?
Yeah, again, I want to emphasize, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a farmer, and I'm not a scientist, but I will tell you, I have sat through a number of sessions that discuss precision agriculture, and it is an important thing. A lot of, the effort is to try and put the fertilizer where it's going to be at the right time. And to not, for instance, a practice that we've had a lot of concern with over the years is fall application of fertilizer. A lot of farmers do that because, they've got their tractor out there already. They just did their harvest. Why don't we just throw a bunch of, anhydrous ammonia on the soil at the same time? The problem is that it's got all winter for it to be rained on and snowed on and flow off. So, much of what they put on in October isn't on the field in the spring, it's in the river. That would be the opposite from precision agriculture. But the idea of precision agriculture, and I've seen, I've heard numerous lectures on this, is to figure out where you need the fertilizer and to apply it properly at the right time. Doesn't mean it can't be screwed up. So, we are dealing with human beings and their systems here.
And the next question asks about the extent to which the TMDL process can address non-point source nutrient pollution.
Yeah. I think you can do some good. In the 90s, there were a number of, I would call them TMDL snake oil salesmen who seemed to think that if you walked into your local courthouse and screamed TMDL loudly enough that it would instantly clean up all of the waters in your state. It never worked that way. And the problem with the TMDL process, well, let me drop back. The TMDL stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. It's a provision of the Clean Water Act that says that if the water is impaired, the state, or if the state won't do it, the federal government is supposed to figure out the total maximum daily load of pollution that's causing that impairment, and then figure out a way to ratchet back the limits so that it doesn't cause that impairment. So let's say we've got, Red Wine Creek in Tennessee, and it's got too much phosphorus in it. And we've decided that it can take 5 pounds a day, but it's got 10 pounds a day. So they're supposed to do this TMDL that works out that number and then come up with an implementation plan which brings the level down. The problem is that agriculture still, you can't force them to do that. So the agriculture has got to be approached generally through voluntary programs. So we've got a, let's say we have a TMDL that says you've got to reduce by 50%. Well, that might mean that the sewage treatment plant's got to shut down and nobody can use their toilet anymore. Or you can assign, if most of the phosphorus in the water or nitrogen is coming from agriculture, there just may not be a good way to write a TMDL that's going to be effective. So it puts some pressure on ag, it puts some pressure on the state to measure the problem and to design a plan that will address the problem, but it just doesn't have the teeth that we would like to see.
We have a question from Linda in Minnesota about buffer zones. Linda, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I think she was responding to what with the governor Dayton, I think.
Yes, Minnesota's got a good buffer zone law. They put that in a few years ago. Maybe Linda has seen data on how well it's worked out. But I just want to say one thing too about in terms of some of these programs, I've forgotten how long the buffer zone law is, how old it is. It's like 5 to 10 years old. Things that happened recently tend to have been about 5 to 10 years now. Unfortunately, we've got our system so clogged with excess phosphorus that in many cases, it's going to take a decade to even see the progress. So it's going to be, it's hard to measure. So I've heard good things about the Minnesota buffer zone law, although there's been some back and forth on how it's enforced, and I think it was narrowed some. And someone from Minnesota would probably know that better than I do.
Thank you. We have a question from Gloria about if our new harmful algae bloom subteam was to start on one federal issue. Do you have a suggestion for what we should do?
Well, yeah, I guess so. There's going to be some interesting action coming out. We were told by Radhika Fox, who's the new assistant administrator for water of US EPA, that they're going to come out with a new phosphorus strategy in the spring. And we'll see what that says, but it will probably be a bunch of recommendations as to how the state should do things better. And that probably won't do a whole lot unless people at the state level get in there and say, hey, we've got this new strategy. What are you going to do, Rhode Island, to put it into effect? And so that's, I think, an avenue which we should be working on and looking forward to working on is doing more to try and get more done on the ground with these federal programs. I mean, that's what most of what we do. We've got the law here and we're trying to actually make it happen. I see John's raised his hand. I don't know whether you can unmute him or which one.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
My question is, my understanding is it takes more energy to create ethanol. 1 gallon that you produce of ethanol, it's less energy than what it takes to make it. And then the extra product that is produced goes to CAFOs. And I was just wondering, through that whole process, maybe have a fair idea. Is that type of feed really bad in CAFOs? And also, you'd be able to reduce, cornfields if we went all electric, and got away from, the ethanol and biofuels. Because battery technology is going pretty fast. And I was just wondering, how much difference you think that would make?
Well, I've looked at this issue from time to time. I'm not a big ethanol fan, I gotta say. I've heard people tell me that, no, it does create more energy than it wastes. But the problem for me is the corn. Particularly coming from the Midwest, I'm not. I'm trying to restrain myself, but I sometimes say that the unofficial slogan of Illinois is corn, coal, and corruption. But the big problem is, when you look at all the fertilizer and the damage it does, when you look at the other problems, and all this corn, it's being used for high fructose corn syrup, it's used for ethanol, and it's used for basically bad cattle feed, which they ship off to feedlots in places like Nebraska. So, the entire national agricultural system, in my view, is completely fucked up, excuse my French. So you've pointed out a lot of different problems, but I don't think there's probably other people on this call who know more about the overall issue than I do.
There's also the water issue too. It uses it wastes an awful lot of water on top too.
That's another problem. And that's in the energy bill. I think we're running, well, I don't have anything planned tonight. I can go later, but I don't know how much longer we've got here.
Well, I do see one last question. If a CAFO is pumping directly from the facility for field spreading, would this require an NPDES permit? In some cases, they pump for miles and spread it on the fields. Well, where does the permit kick in?
Well, that's a difficult question. Basically, if they're purporting to use it for fertilizer, then it's not going to need a NPDES permit. Because I can see how EPA came to this bad decision. People have been using manure for fertilizer for 5,000 years. So it's not an inherently stupid idea to say that you would use manure for fertilizer. The problem is that we're in a context here in which it doesn't make any sense. If you got 10,000 hogs, there's no place efficient to put the fertilizer. And so unlike sewage treatment plant operators or somebody else, I spend a lot of time fighting with sewage treatment plants, but they're our friends. I mean, you don't go into the sewage treatment plant business because you love pollution. On the other hand, the CAFO operator, for them, that waste is just that, it's waste. They got to get rid of it. And they don't really, they got no, I'm not saying they're all evil either, but they've got no business reason to treat it nicely. They've got every business reason in the world to get rid of it as cheaply as they can. And we just don't have any enforcement of that. I actually was on a call with Region 5, and I said, well, there's no enforcement about the no, don't over apply rule. Oh, they said, oh no, we check on that. Oh, sure you do. So I did a Freedom of Information Act request and said, well, please produce all the documents summarizing how you check on manure application for CAFOs here. Well, lo and behold, turns out they check on about 2 facilities a year. But then it looked at it more carefully. they checked on the same 2 facilities in Wisconsin for most of the last 3 years. They were just some theories that somebody had a bug up their butt about. The rest of the country, they don't have any idea what these guys are doing. And I think that's one of the great mysteries we've got. We went to this, I've been going to a number of sessions looking at this. We know we've gotten big cutbacks from the sewage treatment plants, but we're still seeing high phosphorus levels. And we don't know why that is. And I think in many cases, it's the CAFOs that nobody's measuring very well. And by the way, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not proud of it, but I will tell you, it's the CAFOs are, I think, a significant issue.
We're getting quite a few new questions. I don't know whether we're going to be able to go through all of them, but I will ask this one. Is it possible, or is there any research on development of agriculture fertilizer recapturing process?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure what's meant by recapture. I mean, once it's in the water, it's down the stream. What has been done in terms of recapture, and I guess this is, you call this a recapturing process insofar as we all eat and flush the toilet. There's, for example, MWRD in Chicago and other places use one of these processes that basically capture the phosphorus from human sewage and then turn it into fertilizers. So the Astera process, which is one of them, does that. So there are some efforts being made here to close, to close the loop. I don't know of anybody who's proposed going to the Gulf of Mexico and taking nitrate out there and moving it back up to Iowa where it was put, but maybe that's something we'll look at in the future.
The next question asked about nutrient trading, if it will work.
This is the holy grail. I've been hearing about this for 20 years. I'm not saying it won't work, and to some extent, we kind of gotta hope it works, but it's a very difficult thing to do because the idea, what you're doing is you're saying, I think trading's sort of a misnomer because when they did CO2 trading, it was theoretically pretty easy. You could get a reduction in CO2 anywhere in the world, in theory, and reduce the total greenhouse gases. But on nutrients, the fact that you've reduced phosphorus in one creek it's not going to help the creek 5 miles down the road at all. So you really have problems that we call with hotspots. Also, who's going to enforce this? So if Old McDonald says, okay, I'm going to put in a filter strip that will reduce the amount of phosphorus, and as a result of that, the sewage treatment plant 5 miles from here won't have to treat as well. Well, how do we enforce that? Who's going to make sure that Old McDonald puts in that filter strip? Do we know the filter strip's going to be effective? I mean, the sewage treatment plant, we can quantify real well. We're measuring their discharge all the time. We know what they're doing. Old McDonald's farm, it's a very difficult problem. One of the papers, I've got actually a paper on my website in which I was published on this topic. So I'm not totally opposed to it. I think we want to try and do it in some places, but it's very hard to administer. It's not like trading beans.
More questions are coming in, and I'd like to ask Albert about his time. I mean, for those of you on the East Coast, it's getting kind of late. You can go right directly to Albert because he shared his contact information. But how do you feel about 1 or 2 more questions, Albert?
I can go a little longer. I mean, you're keeping me for my evening whiskey, but other than that, I don't have a. It's too late to go to the opera, and and so I'm not really worried about it. So I can take some more questions.
Well, here's a big, long question.
Well, no,
Sewage,
not that one. All right, go on.
sewage is increasingly becoming a problem due to unprecedented growth. Also, with diminishing water in rivers, how can we put more pressure under planning and zoning through planning restrictions and requiring more ecological diversity and hydrology on our planning boards? Under federal law, it seems this is an area we don't utilize since planners are supposed to protect the area. I guess
Okay,
it's
well,
about question about what planning and zoning can do.
okay, I'm not an expert in planning and zoning. I will tell you that there are programs that have to do with stormwater, which have the side effect of dealing with some of those things. For example, another holy grail is green infrastructure. So right now I've been very active working with the city of Chicago to control their combined sewer overflows by doing some of the things that you're talking about, putting in plants and other things that will hold the water or otherwise keep the water from all running in and causing pollution, and instead putting in, trees and other things that will hold the water in the area rather than get it. And this can be done in your NIPID's permit on combined sewer overflows. There's also what's called the MS4 permit. These are stormwater permits. So urban areas have to have federal stormwater permits. That's another point source, is urban stormwater. And as a condition of those urban stormwater permits, under federal law, you can often get the cities or these to put in, or other municipality to put in programs that will do some of the things you're talking about in terms of vegetation or retention ponds or some other things, or green roofs are another big thing that's going on. And these are all part of the green infrastructure idea. And there's no part of the federal law that says thou must have a green roof, but there are federal laws that require that as a condition of putting stormwater or CSO permits, that you have to minimize the flow or minimize the amount of pollution. And that's where you can go in and say, Nowhereville, you're not controlling your runoff very well. You need to put in a program that will have green roofs or more vegetation so that the water that's hitting your streets doesn't run directly into the creek.
That's good. Can you discuss the application of the Clean Water Act to community scale septic systems? And what, yeah,
I
okay.
can, unfortunately.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
two types of septic systems. Or there's many types of septic systems, but there are two that are relevant. One is what I would call a false septic system, which they have in many places, including Illinois, but other states have them also. These are discharging septic systems. So you have I'm sorry for all the genteel people here, because it's just no good way to discuss sewage in a genteel manner. So we've got a toilet, and it's basically got a filter on it, and then it is discharging either to a creek or to the surface of the land on the other side of that filter. That's not a septic system, that's a discharging system. They are generally either illegal or not very workable because they clog up very quickly, and then basically you're putting shit in your neighbor's yard or the creek. They're also called straight pipes sometimes. I could tell you jokes about straight pipes, but that's all right. That is those are false septic systems. We spent a lot of time in Illinois arguing about them. It's a hard issue to work on. It's a hard issue politically because the people who are, living in, they're generally not very wealthy people who have these systems. And you're saying, you got to spend $1,000 to do something that they don't have $1,000 to do it with. But the alternative is just allowing them to put their manure directly in the creek. And so it's a kind of tough issue as opposed to, beating up on Exxon or something, which is maybe harder legally, but it's a lot more satisfying politically. So those are the false systems. If you've got a proper septic system, what that's supposed to do is spread the stuff underground and let it slowly trickle. And if the groundwater is low enough, then it's possible to build a good septic system. It's possible to build a bad septic system, and that's what we find in a lot of places in the country. I think Gloria lives on a lake that's got some bad septic systems on it. And if basically, bear shit in the woods. It normally doesn't cause a big pollution problem because when the bear shits in the woods, it's not in a big concentration and it's not going to cause any problem. There's not that many bears and there's a lot of woods. You get 10,000 hogs doing the same thing in a concentrated area or 3 million people. Now you got an issue. And you've got 100 houses with leaking septic systems around the lake, and your lake's not going to be very pretty for very long. And what they do, if it's a proper septic system, then the Clean Water Act doesn't apply to it because it's not discharging. The Clean Water Act applies to discharges, and if you're just going underground and it's not going to reach surface water, then it's not a Clean Water Act problem. But these false septic systems that I told you about that are discharging systems, they are covered by the Clean Water Act. And, there's all these exceptions to exceptions. There was a Supreme Court case last year, in fact, that had to do with underground discharges or county of Maui, in which they were basically putting sewage underground. It was flowing directly into the Pacific Ocean. That the Supreme Court deemed was a discharge because it was going more or less directly into the waters of the United States. But what the limits of that decision are, how quickly the shit has to reach the water, that hasn't been written up yet. We don't know. There'll be many cases in the future that will deal with that.
Glad you mentioned the Maui case. They also wanted to know your perspective on that.
Well, it was an important case. I mean, and it was the great Justice Gorsuch, who some of you may not like for other reasons, who wrote that decision. So it was a Shakespearean term. It's an ill wind that blows no good. So basically, that was going to be a problem. It's hard to write laws. They want to cover. They're trying to do something that will pass, and they're trying to make distinctions, which in some cases just aren't clear. Sometimes you can write something that's very easy, and then it's too easy. We can draw a bright line, but it doesn't make any sense. I mean, we say it's illegal to drive over 55 miles an hour in an area. Does that mean it's absolutely unsafe to drive 56? No, we've just drawn a bright line. Well, then we could draw a line that says it's improper to drive unreasonably in the area or recklessly. Well, that's great, but what in the hell does that mean? So we've got the Clean Water Act that defines discharges, but there's all these fuzzy edges and nobody, it's very hard to draw a sharp line as to what exactly you're talking about. And what Maui said is essentially, well, if you put it in the ground, you know pretty well, there's a direct connection in relatively quickly to water, then it's a discharge. And they were really, the Supreme Court was really worried about the case that were pointed out by a lot of people of, what if you just cut the pipe 10 feet from the stream and said, oh, well, our pipe's not going in the water now. That's not a discharge. It's flowing across ground for 10 feet before it reaches the stream. Well, we can't, that can't be right. So this case, the Supreme Court came out right with judges who we don't like in some cases on other things. So it's an interesting ruling, actually. And we'll see what comes out of it, because it sets up one of these case-by-case principles. But, in the law, we have both kinds of distinctions. We try and draw sharp lines, and then we sometimes wind up regretting drawing sharp lines. And then in other cases, we have a fuzzy line. I mean, probable cause. Well, what the hell does that mean? Reasonable doubt. What does that mean? Beyond a reasonable doubt, all of these sorts of things. And then we just sort of do it on a case-by-case basis. It's like calling balls and strikes for an umpire. He's not out there with a complicated piece of equipment. And that's kind of what we're doing as to a lot of these laws. We're just, it's fuzzy and we know it's fuzzy.
We have a question about Iowa has a major matrix, but DNR have issued permits in the past. I don't quite understand the question, but just
I don't either. I'd heard the last Matrix movie was horrible. Was that made in Iowa?
Yeah, Maria, could you explain that?
Yes. Well, we have the master matrix, and every year the Board of Supervisors approve that they're gonna follow the matrix. It's a moratorium, no more CAFOs.
Oh, okay. So this is
It's a moratorium with, and also a moratorium where it's gonna be built, and they have to follow steps about the CAFO operation. So unfortunately, Iowa is a deep red. We have 5 Republicans in the Board of Supervisors in Woodbury County, where I live. That's what I'm running, because my plan is to replace the 5 Board of Supervisors. They get away with the master matrix. They file every year. The deadline is on January 31st, and I attended a meeting and I testified, and I gave them my my paper
well,
to approve the master matrix.
okay, I'm gonna have to admit, this is pretty specific to Iowa and I don't know about it. So it sounds like an interesting topic. I gather it has to do with citing CAFOs, which is another whole,
Yes.
another big problem,
my problem is they get away from that master matrix, and there is still, we have buildings, they still CAFOs. We have CAFOs all over Iowa. And
Iowa has got a problem with CAFOs, right?
Yes, yes.
And I don't know what to tell you. Well, I'll tell you a sad story. And I'll tell you that in Illinois, it's bad too on CAFOs, but we did a little better than Iowa because, and I have to put it this way, we passed a law in the 90s, which was really inadequate. and didn't regulate the stuff well at all. But there's a bad joke, and it goes, two guys are walking in the forest and a grizzly bear comes at them, and one of them stoops down and he puts on running shoes. And the other guy turns to him and says, "You idiot, you can't outrun a grizzly bear." And the first guy says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I only have to outrun you." Okay, well, that's basically what we did in Illinois. We didn't outrun the bear, but we outran Iowa. So the CAFOs that were going to us all went to you. And, you know, I regret that. I regret that Iowa and the country as a whole aren't regulating them better. I talked to a farm family outside of Rockford who are actually from Iowa and bought land in Illinois, although it was more expensive and they wanted to stay in Iowa. But they said there was no place that they could find land that they wanted to operate on that wasn't too close to a CAFO. Now, I don't know whether they were exaggerating the situation or not, but
Yeah. Okay, they still building CAFOs. They get away with that. What I will do when I get there, because I plan to win to get in the county board of supervisors. Should I bring the press? Should I report it to the EPA, the national EPA?
I don't know.
And now our governor is just making more and more infringe our right to free speech, free to the press. So
Well,
it's very difficult.
Maria, I wish you luck. And thank you for your bravery in taking on this group of people.
Oh, yes, I have.
Maybe we'll do one or two more questions that I have a chance of answering. And otherwise
Okay, one more question.
all right.
Kind of interesting, actually. Has anyone proposed a price on phosphorus or nitrogen similar to a price on carbon?
Well, has anyone proposed? I mean, perhaps you just proposed it, so I guess that's the answer. I will say that there is something else that we have tried to do, and this is something that you should look at. We have tried to put, and a lot of states have put fees on fertilizer. And what that does, for example, in Illinois, we had, but this is true in a lot of states, they have an exemption from sales tax for farmers for basically everything they buy. And they have but there is a very small, and I mean really small, charge that is placed on fertilizer that was used to operate the fertilizer regulation in the state. So there's a state age department as part of the Illinois Department of Agriculture that regulates fertilizer. And that was financed by this very small charge. We went to the Illinois General Assembly and got them to basically quadruple the charge. And the Farm Bureau agreed to it because they were catching so much flack, in part from the point sources who were going to their legislators and saying, listen, we're having to put in tens of millions of bucks for sewage treatment plants to take phosphorus out. And these idiot farmers are over applying it and doing all these other things. Isn't there something we can do? So the Farm Bureau, and this isn't a big cost to them, agreed to this. And it's raising about, I haven't looked at the figures lately, but it was in the ballpark of $3 million a year. I was at one meeting, I forgot whether it was, the argument was whether it was going to be 50 cents a ton or 75 cents a ton over the charge on the fertilizer. And that would go to this fund to use for programs to address phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer problems on agriculture. So I'm sitting there and I said, well, wait a minute. Well, how much would this cost somebody in terms of fertilizer application for, the average farmer with 1,000 acres? And the lady there from the Farm Bureau said, oh, we think it's going to be about $30 a month. And I said, well, hell, that's less than my bar bill. And the farmers around the table all nodded and said, well, yes, I reckon it's less than my bar bill too. So they went ahead and agreed to the extra 25 cents. And we then raised it's 2 orders of magnitude too low to actually address the problem, but at least we're getting some money there. And that is a price of, that's the closest thing I know of proposed a price for phosphorus or nitrogen that actually has been enacted.
Well, that's a really great example of some negotiations.
Well, and you should look at, Iowa's got a similar program. And we should look at those numbers and see whether they could be, of course, the farmers are always poor mouthing. So, but you can raise a lot of money or, some money there. And if you find that your fertilizer charge is a whole lot lower than neighboring states, that might be an area where you could make some inroads, particularly if you're putting the money into helping the farmers reduce their fertilizer application, then, you don't look too radical that way.
Well, that's really helpful. Well, I think this is a good time for me to thank you, Albert, for all of this that you have shared with us. And I'd like to turn it over to Gloria to wind up our call for the evening.
So, thanks everyone for coming. And as I said at the beginning, we'd love for all of you to join our work with the HAB sub-team of the Sierra Club National Toxics Team, as we are called. We hope to see students, young people, and folks from all different geographical areas join us. We plan to collaborate with other Sierra Club entities like the Water Sentinels, as well as groups and individuals outside of the Sierra Club. Our first Zoom meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, February 16th. I'll send everyone info on how to attend and how to let us know if you'd like to get involved, but you can't make it that night when I send out the recording and the slides tomorrow. We'd also like to start a listserv so we can all share what's happening in the news, in research, different areas of the country, and in our work on this issue. So I'll talk to everybody tomorrow via email, and thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.